Let's talk now to Stephen Hayes. Stephen was former president of the American Center for International Leadership, which was focused on U.S.-Soviet matters at the height of the then Cold War. He has made about 40 trips to the USSR, as it was then known, and now into the 15 republics that emerged from there. His last trip to Russia was in 2019, just before the COVID outbreak. So, Stephen, nice to speak to you. Welcome. I know the timing is really bad, but thank you for your time.
Yes, good morning, and certainly very good morning here. It's very late or very early, a little different, so thank you. It's nice to be here.
Are you surprised that any of the exchanges between the U.S. and Russia give the kind of impression that we're back at the Cold War? Some of the rhetoric is reminiscent of that period, isn't it?
Well, it's somewhat surprising because I think people normally think that life just is a progression and it gets better as you go along. And I think we have come back to almost a full circle and are very close to another Cold War. In fact, I think the situation seems to me right now more dangerous now than it was at almost any point in the Cold War, with the exception of perhaps the Cuban Missile Crises. I think the whole world is facing a crisis now, and this really needs to be solved as soon as possible.
Given the scenario that you just painted, that the situation is more dangerous now than it was, even at the height of that, and given some of the work that you did during that period to bring this to an end, today, that all the parties in this, do they come out having learned any lessons, having given the indication that any lessons were learned from that episode?
This is a great frustration for me because I spent a considerable part of my life, at least a younger part of it, for a couple of decades working on this, and it felt very good that after 90 and perestroika that things would progress, the relationships would grow, and we were going to be able to address global issues collectively. And that simply has not happened. I think Putin has taken it back to the Cold War, and I think that's partly his own background that has made this, in hindsight, perhaps inevitable, because he is what is known as a Chekist, one of the people out of the history of Russia in the Tsar time, as well as during the Soviet Union when the intelligence apparatus ran the country. And I think that's what's happened again in Russia. And so I'm very concerned about that. And the difference now, too, is that the weaponry now is much more sophisticated than it was, say, in 1960, 1970. And this war could be used as a test for the so-called hyper missile that Putin says that Russia now possesses, a missile that can go under radar. So I think we are in very dangerous times.
Let's look at that a little bit. The West is squeezing Russia economically. Russia is squeezing the Ukraine economically and militarily. And the rest of the world is being squeezed by what is going on but from both sides. Again, it seems that we haven't learned the key lessons involved in all of this. Do you think this was a road that we didn't have to travel?
Yeah, I do. I do think that it was avoidable. I think that the discussion on NATO and Ukraine could have been handled much more diplomatically earlier. Whether Putin would have accepted that, I'm not sure. But I think almost any road to war is often could be avoided if the parties really wanted to. I think the problem here is that Putin has already seen Ukraine as part of Russia. In fact, when he first came in, he said that the greatest mistake that was made was that when the Soviet Union was dissolved. And I think he clearly would like to see that come back together, and at least with Ukraine. And in fairness, Ukraine is the underbelly of Russia. So Putin can't see Ukraine as an ally or part of NATO, because then that cuts him off from the Black Sea, it cuts Russia off from the Black Sea. So I think diplomacy should have clicked in much earlier, and people should have understood what was at stake. Now, whether, again, the question in my mind is whether Putin really would have accepted that. He's still very reluctant to accept any negotiations. In fact, so far hasn't, and seems intent to either win or lose entirely, one way or another. And I think, to much of the world's surprise, certainly mine, Ukraine has held out far better than I anticipated.
Vladimir Putin's predecessor in office was Boris Yeltsin, and you took Yeltsin to the United States for his first trip, which would be one of the heights of diplomatic triumphs at the time. So when we talk diplomacy now, one of the things that's been affected by it immediately is trade, and that's an area in which you've worked extensively as well. The economic sanctions that have been imposed on Russia and the ripple-on effect, even in the United States, where gas prices have gone up recently and other products prices are also increasing, not to talk of the rest of the world. Again, the effect on trade is not going to benefit anyone. Do you think that would serve as a motivation to bring the parties, all the parties, back to the negotiating table?
Well, I think it's probably one of the few things we have to get people to the negotiating table now. I don't see any other incentives better than right now the economic incentive. The problem is that sanctions generally hurt the middle class and poor first before they hurt the leadership. The leadership can last a very long time under sanctions. So whether sanctions in and of themselves really solve the issue, I doubt. I'm more concerned with places like Africa, because I've worked in Africa for 20 years as the head of the corporate council in Africa as well. I think the economic problem is going to be one of Russia and Ukraine supply a very large percentage of Africa's agriculture, particularly wheat and corn, and that's simply not going to be flowing into Africa now. So I think there's major problems worldwide on that because of the economic issues. Sanctions in and of themselves, I am not necessarily in favor of sanctions in this case, except in extreme cases. This is clearly an extreme case, but it's a long-term solution. I think even the U.S. administration has said it's not going to change things right away. It's a long-term process.
This is a thin line for the African countries you mentioned, where you've worked. Africa is caught in the middle of this. Many African countries have good relationships with both Russia and with Ukraine, especially even when they were together under the USSR. Right. And now they're almost like they're being careful not to be caught on one side or the other. That has meant that the forecasts for trade growth and economic growth and so on the African continent has been brought down. The forecast has come down progressively over the last couple of weeks that this invasion started. What do you think, having worked with them, what do you think African countries can or should do to, turn this from lemons to lemonade, if that's the phrase?
It's going to be hard, because also a lot of African countries, including Nigeria, get some fertilizer supply out of Russia and Ukraine both, and so it's going to be hard. There is, you hate to look at economic advantages during these times when the war is going on, but where Africa can profit now is and I think the Europeans should also follow this, is see Africa more as a base for fuel rather than Russia. I think they need to invest more in Africa in terms of its energy, particularly natural gas, as well as oil. I think certainly Nigeria is already benefiting. You don't want to see anybody benefit under these circumstances, but Nigeria is benefiting. The price of oil now is over $100 a barrel. So in that case, you can, to use your analogy or metaphor, is that you can make lemonade from what's happening with the energy crises, because there is an energy crisis now too, and Europe was depending on the pipeline from Russia. So now they need to get right away their sources of oil and natural gas from other places, and I think Africa is one of the best places to do that. I think this should also drive Africa to looking at becoming more self-sustaining in its own agriculture production. I've always been an advocate of that Africa needs to grow its own food as much as it does import, and Africa could feed the world. So I think this might be an impetus for Africa to become more self-reliant in agriculture as well.
This might not have been one of the intended consequences of the sanctions and all the squeezing, but I alluded to it earlier on in the conversation where I talked about high gas prices, even in the United States itself. Do you think that public pressure, perhaps, could make Mr. Biden and his administration consider a less hardline, if you like, stance in this matter, and probably work desperately towards bringing Russia and Ukraine back to the table instead of giving the Ukrainian arms?
I think the U.S. Biden deserves some praise for the fact that I think he's handled the crises as best as he can right now. The gas prices themselves, I think, reflect some gouging, because Russia only supplies 1% of all U.S. Energy needs, and that can be replaced very, very easily and very quickly. But yes, I think that high gas prices will eventually put more pressure on the Biden administration, particularly as the midterm elections approach. But I think right now the American people understand this and have been, perhaps surprisingly, in favor of willing to take this pressure. Now, how long they're willing to take that pressure at the gas tank, and it is pretty severe. It's going up about $1 a gallon for me as well. So whether they can take that pressure long term, I don't know. I hope they can. But right now, 78%. The polls show that 78% of the American people are supporting the Biden administration's stance on Ukraine, which also means that they understand why the gas prices are what they are. Although I do think that the oil companies have had their share of driving up the price too, because a 1% decrease doesn't really explain the oil prices going up as much as they have. Gasoline prices, I should say.
The history shows that Russians and Ukrainians are more or less brothers and sisters, and one of the traits that they have is that they are warriors, which is why there are affairs that this isn't going to be easy to bring to a close. President Zelensky of Ukraine is asking for a one-on-one personal meeting with Vladimir Putin, that this matter cannot be resolved without that happening. Do you think that's a wise strategy on his part, given the military facts on the ground, and possibly with the backing of a few other outsiders? Could this really bring this to an end if that meeting takes place?
I question whether, first of all, I think the meeting is important. I think that probably now is the best time for him to do that before there's before there's further Russian gains, and while at the same time the Ukraine army is held firm very well. So I think he's got some chips that he may not have in a few weeks. So I think now is the time to reach out. I think he needs to be very careful in that meeting and make sure he's protected as well, by the way. But I think it can only, you're right, it can only be resolved by face-to-face meeting with either their respective teams or they themselves. But I just don't think Putin is the type of person, based on, in part, all my experience in the old Soviet Union, which he is much more a part of than he is the modern Russia. I think Putin is unlikely to accept terms, because I think he also sees himself losing if he doesn't completely win this. I hope he doesn't win this.
Finally, I must ask this, and it's quite fascinating because it's Putin that ordered the invasion of Ukraine. You've talked about his background being more of the old Soviet than more of the new Russian. What kind of psychology do you think is driving him right now? Because in Russia, basically, he's the man to go to. It's not exactly the kind of democracy that is operated in the United States, is it?
Well, it's clearly not a democracy any longer. He's already said that traitors need to be eliminated, and that means demonstrators, everything else. He's going back to more a Stalinist model, and I think this in fact was a more historic model, which he's more comfortable with. I don't think there's a bit of Democrat or sympathy with democracy in his bones. I think that this is why I think we're in a particularly dangerous time, because of that mentality and that psychology. He is of the old KGB. He felt humiliated, as many others did, at a time when you remember that he started in the 1980s in the KGB, and that was at the time when Russia was seen as losing the Cold War. I never thought it should put it that way. It was an opportunity, really, to bring both sides together rather than declare winners and losers. And I think that he felt humiliated, and I think that's carried over. And I think his statement since he became head of the Soviet Union has just reinforced that. He feels that the old Soviet Union, the old Russian Empire, needs to be rebuilt, and that we need to respect Russia more, which I think is kind of silly, because I think Russia should be respected in any case. It's a great country. It has resources the rest of the world doesn't have in many cases, and yet there's this inferiority complex, or this anger about not having the same, being seen as one of the great powers any longer, that both China and the U.S. have surpassed that. I think that's unfortunate, but I think that's part of his mentality.
Stephen Hayes, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. And once again, have a very good morning. It's very, very early in Washington. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. It was an honor.
We'll take a break, and when we come back, we'll bring you other stories on this invasion.